What do you picture when you imagine colonial America? In this program, you'll see the great variety of people and ways of life that existed in North America in the 1700s. The Massachusetts sea merchant, the pioneer woman, the wealthy plantation owner, the African slave. These were very different people, and yet they shared something in common: a growing belief in the promise of a new nation based upon the principle of freedom. As early as the 1600s, America was becoming a land that was culturally rich and diverse, as people of all different backgrounds came to its shores to create a home and a new life on foreign soil. In the areas that would soon be known as New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, settlers from other countries such as Sweden and the Netherlands had already made an impact. The Scandinavians built trading posts along the Delaware River, and they introduced the log cabin to America. This practical, sturdy construction could be built quickly and with only an axe. It became the standard for pioneer settlements. Log cabin life was rugged, usually consisting of one small room with no windows and a single door. The cabin could be stifling hot in summer. Cooking was usually done outdoors. The Swedes were situated between Philadelphia and Baltimore, destined to become two of America's most important port cities because they were founded at the fall line.
The fall line. What's the fall line? Well, that's the first waterfall that you encounter on a river coming up from the Atlantic seaboard. Why is that important? Because if you want to penetrate to the interior, you've got to transship things. So, a ship can't go above the waterfall.
It took at least 50 to 100 acres just to support a family. And so if you were going to become a significant farmer, you needed to be in that tidewater area, the area where the rivers came through. As you move closer back to the Appalachian Mountains, there's the Piedmont area, which is the much more hilly, not yet mountainous, but hilly area where you only can carve out smaller areas to farm.
By the 1700s, each town or county in the American colonies had some form of representative government. Colonies were either royal, proprietary, or self-governing. In royal colonies, the governor was appointed by the King of England. In proprietary colonies, a governor was appointed by the investment company or individual that had founded the colony. And in self-governing colonies, the governor was elected by white land-owning males in the colony. Women, Native Americans, and African Americans were not permitted to vote. The last of the original 13 English colonies was founded in 1732. Georgia was named for King George II by James Oglethorpe, the colony's founder. Oglethorpe wanted to start an ideal colony, a haven for England's poor. In England, poverty was a crime, and Oglethorpe tapped the debtors' prisons of England for colonists.
Oglethorpe's idea is, let's have a society of freemen on the southern boundary of South Carolina, and we will therefore prohibit slavery, prohibit all strong alcohol. What they found was that most of the settlers who went there wanted alcohol and wanted slaves. And they also found that the place wasn't terribly healthy.
The hope, too, was that Georgia would provide a buffer zone between South Carolina and Spanish Florida and help secure the region. Life in Georgia was hard. Pirates roamed the coast and captured their supply ships. Spain controlled Florida and now claimed Georgia as well as the Carolinas, so fighting along the border was frequent. Oglethorpe lost his money and gave up his plan. The king made Georgia a royal colony in 1752. There were now 8 royal colonies: Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Connecticut and Rhode Island were self-governing, and Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware were owned by individual proprietors, the Penns and the Calverts. Throughout the colonies, wealth equaled power, And there was sharp contrast between the life of the wealthy landowner and the working class. Wealthy white children received a good education. Boys were encouraged to hunt and ride horses. Girls rode horses too, but were expected to sew and entertain.
The education of a child in the 17th and 18th century is much more a question of a child learning a trade. For male children, it is generally learning outdoor trades. For female children, it's learning indoor trades. That is cooking, gardening, which is considered somewhat of an indoor trade, particularly a kitchen garden outside the kitchen. A young woman would learn how to grow herbs and spices and how to use those for medicinal purposes.
Only boys went to college, either to one of several colleges in the colonies or to England. However, the inequity of education in the colonies would slowly change. As a result of the Massachusetts school law, the first public schools in North America were created in New England. Every town with 50 or more families was required by law to hire a schoolmaster.
In New England in particular, the colonies put a strong emphasis on literacy because they wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible and the capital laws of the colony so that they'd know what they could be hanged for.
The middle colonies were slower to embrace public education. Settlers came from many countries, spoke many languages, and practiced many faiths. For this reason, schools were usually run by churches. The Quakers established schools that were considered among the most excellent. In the southern colonies, the gap between rich and poor made any type of universal free education impossible for decades to come. In Virginia, for example, there was virtually no middle class, and poor farming families lived a very hard existence. Often, an entire family slept in one room on mattresses of straw. Most people owned one set of clothes, the ones they wore, and perhaps a special shirt for Sunday. A wealthy plantation owner, on the other hand, lived a very different lifestyle. One man in Virginia might own several plantations, each run by a brother or a cousin, and worked mostly by slaves. The plantation owners and their families enjoyed lives of great privilege and comfort. Children had tutors, and families had much leisure time to travel to grand parties, enjoy fox hunts and horse races. At the center of a social whirlwind was Williamsburg, Virginia's seat of government and a bustling town of shops and businesses. Cabinet makers, blacksmiths, hat makers, and dry goods merchants lined the busy streets. Williamsburg sponsored popular town fairs featuring horse races and contests of skill. But there was another Williamsburg. More than half the population of Williamsburg were enslaved African Americans. Far across the ocean in Africa, coastal peoples delivered slaves captured from the interior to European and American merchants at the ports. The African coastal states prospered from the trade in cloth, arms, and ammunition, and were able to rid themselves of their traditional enemies. By contrast, interior states in Africa, previously stable, were extremely weakened by the slave trade. The horror of slavery is expressed in accounts of the Middle Passage, the journey by ship from Africa to the American colonies and from freedom to the slave market. During the trip, which took about 10 weeks to complete, many of the slaves, shackled to one another in the dark holds of the ships, died. The living and the dead often lay fastened together. There was little air, food, water, and no room. The first Africans came to the Americas long before the majority of European settlers. Altogether, 10 million Africans were brought by force to the so-called New World. Their hard labor in the fields of the farms and plantations, their skilled labor in the trades, and their household labor in the plantation manors and town estates made much of life in Williamsburg and indeed the Southern economy itself possible. Whenever they could, Africans resisted slavery.
It's best, I think, to think of it along a continuum that ranged from the fairly subtle, that is, the work slowdown, or the sick out, people just being too sick to work or claiming to be too sick to work or working very slowly, at the one end, all the way to suicide at the other end, self-destruction at the other end. Along that continuum, you would find people doing things like breaking tools or taking a vacation, just disappearing for a day and running away to the woods and staying there for a while. One might attack one's master or mistress. One might mutilate oneself, cut one's hand, whatever. Or one occasionally might rebel entirely and encourage other people to rebel and simply strike out, as people did in various slave revolts, strike back against the system.
By the 1680s, a single southern plantation required the labor of nearly 50 people to run it. Each plantation was like a small village, dominated by the main house, or big house. There were many smaller buildings, including the laundry and kitchen. Most plantations were built along a river and had their own docks for loading and shipping tobacco. The tobacco was packed in barrels, which a cooper, or barrel maker, made right on the property. Stables, barns, and buildings for the farm's produce were required. Cabins were built near the fields to house the slaves. The cabins were often inadequate, cold and drafty in the winter, stifling hot in summer. They were often bug-infested. Some plantations housed as many as 200 slaves. In most colonies, slaves were not permitted to marry, to read, to travel about freely, or to take sick rest.
In the evenings, it was often the case that once the sun went down, some slave owners would say, I don't want to know what they're doing once the sun went down. And when the sun went down, people got together, sometimes had religious services, sometimes had picnics on their evenings or days off.
There's no debate about slavery until after the middle of the 18th century. Up until then, we think, they considered slavery just the most extreme example of social inequality. And as far as they were concerned, all societies are inherently unequal. That is, some people are more important than others.
The plantation owners used many excuses to justify keeping slaves. Some professed to be against slavery but felt that their slaves could not survive without them, nor they without their slaves. They convinced themselves that the slaves were better off on the plantations than in society, where they would be persecuted and perhaps captured by a really abusive slaveholder. These rationalizations were untrue. Although many slaveholders were not actually abusive, the very experience of slavery was demoralizing and wrong. It seemed that religion had taken a back seat to the everyday pressures of living. New England Congregationalists, along with Middle Colony and Southern Presbyterians, began a counterattack on religious complacency. This movement, called the Great Awakening, sent spiritual shockwaves throughout the colonies. A preacher named Jonathan Edwards took Connecticut by storm with his radical sermons and his book, which became known as the Faithful Narrative. His writings influenced George Whitefield in Savannah, Georgia, to such an extent that he became the first true American evangelist. It is said that a crowd of 10,000 people could hear his every word, so loud and exuberant were his sermons. One central idea of the Great Awakening was the separation of church and state. The movement spawned a flurry of Baptist and Methodist churches and universities, such as Princeton, Dartmouth, and Brown. The Great Awakening cut across class barriers and taught that each person was equal in the eyes of God. People began to call one another brother and sister. In this new atmosphere, many people became opposed to slavery. Much of the land along the East Coast was now claimed. Newcomers wishing to find open space which they could farm were obliged to push west. The thickly forested hills that bordered the coastal plains were destination for some. Others pushed further into the rugged Appalachian Mountains and beyond.
A wife who was having 10 or 11 or 12 children might well be on the road pregnant. So she's walking while pregnant, while caring for another child. There are concerns about whether or not the water is safe to drink, and if you get unsafe water, you could end up with a digestive problem that would cause all kinds of problems for babies and children. Food was generally not easy to come by. You got whatever you could carry with you, or if you were lucky, what you could hunt.
The brave souls who built their homesteads in the wilderness were called frontiersmen and frontierswomen, trailblazers, pathfinders, pioneers. One among them was named Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was a wagon driver during the French and Indian Wars, but he earned his fame and recognition as a trailblazer. In 1775, he learned of a secret Indian trail that he followed to the Cumberland Gap, a hole in the mountains that led to the grasslands of Kentucky. Boone and 30 woodsmen cleared the trail into a road, the Wilderness Road. By 1790, it was 300 miles long, and more than 200,000 people had traveled it west with their families, wagons, and animals. Boone's adventures were followed with great interest by whites and Indians alike. He seemed to have 9 lives, and many tales were told of his narrow escapes and daring rescues. Later in life, he moved to Missouri, and when asked why he was leaving his beloved Kentucky, he replied, "Too crowded." The pioneers learned much from the Indians about survival in the wilds, but often they fought the Native Americans for their land, pushing them into hostile territory. This led to raids and skirmishes both between Indian and settler and among the Indian tribes themselves. The Shawnee Indians, in particular, fought back to protect their lands in Kentucky. Daily living was hard work for every member in the pioneer family. Wood, although abundant for building and fuel, had to be chopped down by hand and logs split. Men, women, and children worked from sunrise to sunset, hunting, planting, chopping wood, cooking, hauling water, and building. Accidents were common, but there was no medical care available, nor were there schools, and children received what little formal training they got from their parents. Still, the wilderness had an allure, and families continued to carve lives for themselves out of the primitive forests and grasslands. A very different kind of social life was developing in the great cities of Philadelphia and Boston. By 1750, many Philadelphia streets were paved and lit with whale oil streetlights. For its nearly 20,000 residents, the city that William Penn established now offered 3 libraries, a hospital, a college, a police force, and a fire station. Philadelphia's most famous and beloved resident, Benjamin Franklin, could take credit for creating some of these institutions. Franklin was also famous as a printer, inventor, and diplomat. The city was decidedly cosmopolitan. Dutch, Swedish, and German farmers brought produce from their fields to be sold on market days. Cries of peddlers and fishmongers filled the air. Tailors, weavers, silversmiths, and blacksmiths worked their craft in shops along the city streets. With her fine harbor on the Delaware River, Philadelphia thrived from energetic trade with England. Luxury goods from Great Britain, including hats, boots, lace, and silver goods, filled shop windows. The Massachusetts economy was focused on the sea. Fishing and shipping developed together as Massachusetts' 2 main industries. By the 1760s, Massachusetts exported about 35 million pounds of fish to Europe and the West Indies. Racks upon racks of drying, salted cod were a familiar sight in Boston Harbor. Roads were dreadful in New England, so much overland travel occurred in the winter, in horse and ox-drawn sleds. Towns were prosperous along the coast and developed their own maritime specialties, from whaling to the exportation of lumber. In time, the building of large sea-going cargo vessels was added. But the Navigation Acts, beginning in 1651, required that all shipping in the colonies be conducted on English-owned ships.
The motivation behind the Navigation Acts was to increase the power of England as a state in the European state system. And by the early 18th century, you'd have to say that the overwhelming majority of all staple crops are traveling in English ships and going to England before they go, or Scotland, before they go anywhere else. That all of the trade of the colonies is in English ships.
Trade routes between the colonies and West Indies flourished. A triangular pattern of trade emerged that began with New England merchants sending fish and lumber to the West Indies. On the return voyage, molasses and sugar were carried to make into rum. Rum, guns, and cloth were then sent to Africa and traded for a human cargo of captive slaves. In New York, the transition from Dutch to English rule had been accomplished smoothly. However, many colonists continued to demand home rule. They especially resented the burden of taxes the English imposed on imports. New York had become an important economic center. Banking, investment, and trade dominated political discussion. A wealthy and influential merchant class developed. Jews began to arrive in small numbers in New York as early as 1654. One of them, Asser Levy, became wealthy selling finished goods imported from Amsterdam and was the first Jew to own property and serve on a colonial jury. Although lifestyles varied from colony to colony, life in all the colonies and on the frontier was characterized by very basic similarities: enduring the hardships of day-to-day existence, having the freedom to worship or not to worship, working from dawn to dusk in order to build better lives for themselves and their children, and enjoying the simple abundance of a fertile, uncrowded land. The great diversity of colonial experience in America was influenced by factors of geography, climate, religious belief, and national origin. What role would the English colonies, now at the forefront in population and industry, play? And how would marginalized people, like the Africans, the Jews, and the poor European immigrants waiting on the horizon, fare in the land of freedom? The answers would lie ahead in the hearts and minds of men and women, some not yet born, individuals who would lead, fight, and finally unite the diverse peoples across the land and give them a common name: Americans. By the 1700s, each town or county in the American colonies had some form of representative government. The horror of slavery is expressed in accounts of the Middle Passage, the forced journey by ship from Africa to North America. Pioneers sought new land to farm or homestead, but they often took it at the expense of Native Americans. Colonial diversity was influenced by factors of geography, climate, religious belief, and national origin.